All right, let's get right into it. We're going to talk about how the largest empire in the history of the world really ended. And here's the twist. It wasn't on a battlefield with guns and glory. Nope. It ended on a balance sheet. This is the story of how a superpower was brought to its knees by its closest friend.
You know, this one sentence just says it all, doesn't it? It gets right to the heart of what happened. This wasn't about losing a war. This was about a financial weapon, deployed from a quiet, air-conditioned room somewhere in Washington, D.C.
So, Section 1, an empire foreclosed. Now, to really wrap our heads around this, we're actually going to start at the end. The very dramatic end with the Suez Crisis of 1956. This was the moment the curtain was pulled back, and the world learned a really brutal lesson about who was actually in charge.
And this, right here, is the central paradox of the whole story. Militarily, the operation was a textbook success. British paratroopers were advancing, the Egyptian Air Force was toast, they were winning. But none of it mattered, because a single phone call from the United States unleashed a financial assault that forced a humiliating, total retreat. So you have to ask, right? How on earth did the empire that ruled the waves, the global superpower of the 19th century, get into a position where its ally could just decline its credit card? Well, to get that answer, we've got to rewind the clock about 16 years, to the absolute darkest days of World War II.
That brings us to Section 2, the secret bill for World War II. This is where we find the original wound. And it wasn't inflicted by an enemy bomb, it was inflicted by the cold, hard economics of total war, all managed by Britain's closest ally, the United States.
See, in the early days of the war, America was officially neutral. And hey, they were happy to sell Britain the weapons it needed to survive. But the policy was called cash and carry. It meant gold on the barrelhead. No credit, no IOUs. And this forced Britain to start draining its massive treasury just to stay in the fight.
And this was incredible. We're talking about the largest physical movement of wealth in all of human history. Battleships racing across the Atlantic, dodging German U-boats, carrying billions in gold bars. But by the end of 1940, even that wasn't enough. Britain was flat broke, completely.
So now, with Britain bankrupt, President Roosevelt comes up with the Lend-Lease Act. And he sells it to the American people with this wonderfully folksy analogy. He says, look, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sell him your garden hose. You lend it to him. It sounded so generous.
But here's where it gets really interesting. That was the public story. Behind closed doors, it wasn't a neighborly chat. It was a brutal foreclosure. The U.S. Treasury basically demanded a full audit of the entire British Empire, forcing Britain to prove it had stripped itself of every last asset before it would get a single dime of aid. And the most painful symbol of all this, a company called American Viscose. It was a hugely profitable American company, but it was owned by the British. It was an absolute jewel in their portfolio of overseas investments, worth well over $100 million. And the U.S. Treasury, it had its eyes on it.
The ultimatum was simple. Sell the company, or the Lend-Lease bill dies in Congress. The British were completely cornered. They were forced into a fire sale, and the company was sold for about half of what it was actually worth. You could call it a hostile takeover by an ally. And every single penny went straight to the U.S. Treasury to pay for weapons.
Okay, Section 3, paying for victory. So Britain makes it through the war, thanks in large part to American supplies. But the financial reckoning that came next, well, that would prove to be just as devastating as the war itself, and it would cement America's new position as the top dog.
I mean, you can't make this up. The moment victory is declared, the lifeline is just cut. No warning, no grace period. American ships literally in the middle of the Atlantic, carrying food and supplies, were ordered to turn around. Britain went from victory to bankruptcy overnight. So, what happens? Britain has to go back cap in hand to beg for another loan. Not a gift like the Marshall Plan for Germany, but a loan. And it came with some real poison pill conditions. The deadliest one was a demand to make the British pound fully convertible to the US dollar, a move that was basically designed to shatter Britain's imperial trading bloc. And look how this trap sprung. The second that window for convertibility opened, there was a massive run on the pound. I mean, why wouldn't there be? Everybody wanted to dump their pounds to get their hands on US dollars so they could buy superior American goods. In just 5 weeks, a huge chunk of that loan just vanished. Britain had to slam the window shut, totally humiliated. All right, Section 4, the weaponized dollar. Now we fast forward to 1956. We're about to see how all of this financial weakness, built up over a decade, allowed the U.S. to deliver the final, fatal blow during the Suez Crisis. So the British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, he saw the nationalization of the Suez Canal as an existential threat. And frankly, he was blinded by old-school imperial pride. He was convinced America would have his back in the end, so he just walked right into the trap, completely underestimating this new kind of financial warfare.
And it's so important to remember this part. From a purely military perspective, the invasion was a huge success. The Egyptian Air Force was gone. Paratroopers were on the ground, and they were advancing easily. On paper, they were absolutely winning the war.
But here's the reality that was happening back in the markets. A furious President Eisenhower, who felt totally betrayed, gave a very simple order to his Treasury Secretary. He said, "Break the pound." And so the U.S. started dumping British currency, which triggered a global panic. Britain was hemorrhaging tens of millions of dollars a day just trying to keep its currency from collapsing.
And then the U.S. just twisted the knife. Britain tried to get its own emergency funds out of the IMF. The U.S. used its power to block the loan. And to make it even worse, with the canal blocked, Eisenhower refused to send emergency oil from America. He famously told an aide they could boil in their own oil. I mean, wow.
Which brings us to our final section, the new rules of power. In the end, the ceasefire was called not because they were losing on the battlefield, but because the Chancellor of the Exchequer told the Prime Minister that Britain was just days away from total financial collapse. The war was lost not when a battle was lost, but when the nation's credit card was declined.
And this slide just perfectly illustrates the massive shift that Suez revealed to the entire world. The age of gunboat diplomacy? Over. Power didn't grow from the barrel of a gun anymore. It grew from the servers of a central bank. The U.S. Treasury was now officially more powerful than the Royal Navy had ever been.
So, what's the big takeaway here? Britain was forced to liquidate its empire. It started granting independence to colonies, not just for moral reasons, but for fiscal ones. The empire was now a luxury item it simply could not afford. It was a fire sale, all to balance a budget that had been broken by war and then broken again by its ally.
Ultimately, the Suez Crisis proved something profound. It proved that the nation that controls the world's reserve currency can bring another nation to its knees without firing a single shot. It laid down a whole new set of rules for the global game, a lesson that is, without a doubt, still shaping geopolitics to this very day.